Chapter 14. They were up before dawn. By the light of a few candles, by the light of a few candles, they ate a quick breakfast and made their final preparations. This just keeps sliding. Into the 4 packs went their food, extra clothing, blankets, and camping gear. To the outside of Franz's and Saxo's packs were strapped the 2 tents that had been brought up from Broly. Man, that just keeps sliding. We'll try that. For long hours the previous evening, the 2 guides in Winter had discussed the plan of attack. It was their hope that they would have to spend only one night on the mountain, for the route to the base of the southeast ridge had now been established, and Rudy had pioneered the way to the top of the fortress and reported no major obstacles on the ridge above. If all went well, they would be able to pitch camp near the shoulder, make their bid for the top the next morning, and descend all the way before dark. As old mountain hands, however, they knew that all might not go well. The weather might break, there might be difficulties and mishaps, and they were therefore taking enough food for a possible second night out. This would allow them 3 full days on the mountain, and if it could not be climbed up and down in that time, it could probably not be climbed at all. 4 to go, 5 to remain behind. Of the 5, Crickle, Peter, Toglich, Wesselhoft, and Old Tio were to spend the day and night at the hut, and the next day the first 3 would start up toward the base of the ridge to meet and help the climbers on their way down. Tio, too old and crippled for this, would remain at the hut and have a hot meal awaiting their return, and Paul Toglich would descend this morning to Kurtel to bring word to the waiting village of what was happening. I'm glad to hear that. I was worried about the poor mother at the village. At first it had been assumed that old Tio would be the one to go down, but he had flatly refused. 15 years ago I did what I could on this mountain, he told them, and now again I shall do what I can. But your work, someone pointed out, won't they expect you at the hotel? Yes, they will expect me, and a certain dishwasher as well. A smile deepened the creases of his leathery face. But for a few days the tourists can eat sandwiches while I am chef to the conquerors of the citadel. No one wanted to go down, and finally Paul Toglich had been chosen by lot. That's kind of like you roll dice to see who has to go. He would report to the mayor, the guide central committee, the whole town. But first of all, Franz told him, you must speak to my sister. She has now been waiting 2 days and must be almost out of her mind. You will go to her right away, yes, and tell her we have found the boy? Toglich nodded. But now, not that he is climbing the mountain, only that we have found him, that he is here at the hut and all right. For the love of God, not that he is on the mountain. You need not worry, said Toglich. In a corner of the hut, Rudy quietly packed his knapsack. He had slept long and well. The ordeal of his solitary climb seemed far behind him. He felt rested, strong, and calm. Yes, most of all, and most strangely, calm. For now at last the awful uncertainty had ended. The hoping and despairing had ended. The decision had been made, and there was a job to do. Gratitude filled his heart. To Captain Winter and old Tio, who had championed him. To his uncle, who had finally accepted him. And along with gratitude, a resolve as deep and inward as his very being. Whatever happened, he would not fail them. He would be worthy of their trust. He packed his share of the food supply. It was not a full share. He had insisted he could carry more, but the men had said no, this was enough. He packed the utensils that had been assigned to him and a few items of clothing loaned by the guides, for his own had been hopelessly soaked and ripped during the 2 previous days. Snug in the middle of the sack, he stowed the old red flannel shirt, and to its outer straps he lashed his 4-foot pole. There was a guffaw close behind him, and looking up he saw Saxo. Going fishing, boy? Asked the man from Broly. No, sir, it's only... Come on, take it off. It will make the climbing harder. Saxo reached out for it, but Rudy stopped him. No, he said, no, please, I must take it. Franz and Winter had come up. Take it? Why? Said his uncle. What use is such a stick? You have a fine new axe. Yes, I know, but this is for... He couldn't say it. But I use this sometimes too. Nonsense, take it off. Please, uncle. If he wants it so much, why not let him take it, said Winter. I've seen him climb with it. In fact, he once saved my life with it. Maybe it will be useful again. Rudy looked at him gratefully. Franz seemed about to argue, but changed his mind, and Saxo turned away with a shrug. If he gets stuck in a chimney, he said, don't say we didn't warn you. Okay, and you wonder what he wants that pole with, but then you look at the front cover of the book, and it kind of actually foreshadows what might happen. Now they were ready. They slung on their packs, hefted their axes, stamped with their stiff boots on the old plank flooring. The others were going to go with them as far as the top of the Blue Glacier, and from there Paul Toglich would start down toward Kurtal, and the rest would return to the hut. One by one they filed out the door. It was still night as they descended through the boulders beneath the hut, but by the time they were out on the glacier, the darkness had begun to pale. It was a perfect dawn, clear, windless, and dry. The peaks, emerging slowly from obscurity, had received no new snow during the night, and their ridges rose sharply and bare against the graying sky. Gazing up at the vast walls of the citadel, the climbers knew, with a lift of their hearts, that if ever they could scale it, it would be on a day like this. In less than half an hour they reached the parting of their ways. Not a word had been spoken on the march, and now the farewells were brief, a clasping of rough hands. Grüß Gott, go with God. Then Paul Toglich was on his way down the Blue Glacier, and those who were to wait at the hut turned to go back. But for a moment before he left, Theo Zurbriggen stood close beside Rudy. Remember what you've learned, boy, he said. Rudy nodded. And remember this too, if there is trouble, if there are any problems to face, and you are in doubt what to do, ask yourself only one question. What would my father have done? I will, said Rudy. The others had already started off, and Theo limped after them, but after a few paces he looked around and shouted, And come down quickly, La Sobi, or our kitchen will be full of dirty dishes. And now again, for the third time, Rudy was ascending the steep tributary glacier that slanted up toward the base of the citadel. They were all on one rope, Saxon, Captain Winter, his uncle, and himself, in that order, and using the steps that had already been cut, they moved easily and steadily. When he first turned and looked back, the others were already out of sight below, and by sunrays they were at the crest of the glacier and crossing the snow bridge over the Bergschrund. They threaded the steep maze of the icefall and moved up the snow slope beyond, by now as familiar to Rudy as the forest paths 6,000 feet below. All traces of the avalanche were gone, obliterated by the snowfall during the recent storm. But in the cool of the morning, the new snow was firm and sound, and they climbed straight upward without fear of another slide. Instinctively, the boy's eyes went up the cliff on the left, where he had seen the chamois, which is a sort of goat, or mountain goat, I believe, 2 days before. But this time there was no hint of movement on the gray walls of rock. He bent his head to the slope, kick, step, kick, step, kick, step. And when he next looked up, they were at the base of the ridge. Here, for the first time, they rested. They had a slab of bread each and a swallow of tea. Then they were on their feet again, peering upward. You take the lead now, Rudy, Captain Winter suggested. You're the one who knows the way. Rudy hesitated. He glanced at his uncle, who seemed about to protest, but in the end Franz said nothing, and he moved out in front. His uncle was now directly behind him on the rope, with Winter and Saxo in the third and fourth positions. He was well aware of the honor and responsibility that had been conferred on him, and he climbed with the utmost care. For the first long stretch of the ridge, however, the going was better than he had dared hope. Wind and sun had done their work well, blowing the snow away, melting the ice patches, leaving the rock bare and dry. Even when they reached the steeper pitches which had slowed him up on his first ascent, he now had no trouble at all. For, whereas before he had to search for holds and stances, he now remembered them well and swung up surely and easily. Best of all, he was no longer alone and afraid. He had confidence in himself and the confidence of others. There was no wind, the sun was brilliant. Soon they were sweating from their exertions and paused to take off their outer jackets. Then they were climbing again, climbing, up the narrowing ridge, across the knife edge, toward the towering Gendarmes, out onto the south face, past the Gendarmes, back to the ridge, on, up the spine of the ridge, while the precipices on either side dropped away steeply and the glaciers and valleys receded slowly into the distance. An hour, 2 hours. Then at last the ridge broadened and flattened, and they pulled themselves up onto the level platform of rock and stood facing the sheer wall of the fortress. For a moment Rudy's eyes fixed on the shallow cave at its base, but for only a moment. Then he turned, moving along the platform toward the south face, and his uncle and Winter followed him. Saxo, however, lingered behind, staring up at the granite battlements. Wait, he called after them. The others looked back, and he gestured. It can be climbed here, he said, here on the right. No, the way's around on the left, Winter said. Joseph Matt's way, the way Rudy climbed. If you come here to the ledge, said Rudy, you will see the cleft. And I do not need to see it, Saxo interrupted. There's a route up the wall. It will go. But it will go, I tell you. The three others returned to where he stood. Perhaps it will, said Winter, but since one way has already been found, why bother with... Because I say there is a better way. Saxo's eyes were sullen and defiant. You've employed me as your guide, have you not, Herr Winter? That is what I am, a master guide of Broly, and I'm getting tired of following these Kurtalers, as if I were some sort of tourist. But the boy's been here before. You know that. He climbed the clefts, and I don't care what the boy has done. As a guide, it is my professional opinion that this is the best route. There was a silence. Winter bit his lip. Since the previous day, when by main force of will he had brought them together, he had no trouble with the guides. True, they had scarcely exchanged a word, but at least they had worked together and come this far without argument, and he had hoped they could go the whole way in the same spirit. Obviously, though, it had been too much to expect. I'm sorry, Emil, he said firmly, but I think the boy's route would be better. You mean, said Saxo, that you refuse to follow my advice? In this case, yes. I promise you that later on you'll have plenty of chances to lead the way. Saxo looked at the ground, scowling. Then he looked up at the fortress and made a move as if to untie himself from the rope. He didn't, though. Instead, he turned away with a shrug. Yes, later perhaps we shall see, he muttered as he followed the others across the platform. Rudy still went first. Following the ledge that curved out over the south face, he reached its end and inched out into the bulging cliff beyond. With Franz belaying the rope, he made the crossing without difficulty. Then he in turn belayed his uncle, and behind them came Saxo and Winter, safeguarding each other. In less than 10 minutes they were all together at the foot of the great cleft, then up again. And as on the ridge and the bulge, the going was far easier for Rudy now that he knew the way and was no longer alone. Or at least it was easier until he reached the narrow shaft-like section halfway up, and then suddenly there was a scraping noise at his back, and he stuck fast. "Is that pole of yours?" Franz called from below. Rudy knew well enough what it was. The two ends of his staff had become wedged against the walls of the cleft, and now he was struggling desperately to free them and at the same time not lose his holds on the smooth vertical rock. "Try to slip off your pack," Franz called. "Then you can untie the thing and leave it there." But Rudy was not leaving the staff if there was any way to help it. He jerked and wriggled and thrust himself upward and sideways, and at last its ends grated loose. "All right, now untie it," called his uncle. "Get rid of it. Throw it away." Rudy pretended not to hear. Reaching a hand back over his shoulder, he tugged at the staff, trying to shift it from a horizontal to a vertical position. The best he was able to do was to get it diagonal like a slung rifle. But at least he could now move again, and though Franz was still shouting at him to untie and drop it, he resumed climbing on the cleft. Now and then there was an ominous scraping of wood on stone. At the great chalk stone, which called for a delicate climbing, there was a bad moment when it caught in a crevice overhead. But this time a mere dipping of his shoulders released it, and beyond the chalk stone there were no further difficulties. In a few minutes they were out of the cleft, and on the top flat of the fortress, the four of them, and his pole. To his relief, his uncle had made no further mention of it. "Not bad at all, my boy," was his only comment, and something very close to admiration shone in his eyes. Winter grasped Rudy's hands and pressed it warmly, and even Saxo conceded. "Ja, it was all right. It went." Then as an afterthought he added, "although straight up the wall would have been better." They rested again and ate and drank sparingly. The sun was now almost midway across the sky, and the mountain world around them glittered in the full brightness of noon. It was not around them that they looked, however, but only up and ahead, at the long, jagged slant of the upper ridge, the walls and crags tearing above it, the citadel's shoulder jutting broad and white-rimmed against the blue depths of space. As Rudy had reported, there was no major obstacle, or at least none was visible, but they knew that the mountain, before it was through with them, would exact every last ounce of their strength and skill. They rose, and they started off again, and now their order of ascent was reversed, with Saxo and Winter going first, Franz and Rudy following. But Rudy did not mind being last. He had brought them safely this far, he had his full share of learning, and now it was his turn to follow, while older, more experienced hands forged the way. He moved on steadily after his uncle, taking care to see that there was neither too much nor too little slack in the rope that joined them. He watched his holds and balance as carefully as when he had been out ahead. Not once, he was resolved, would he hamper or delay the others. Never would he give them cause to regret that they had allowed him to come. Up they went, the first of all the men to enter the secret world above the world. The first of all living things, too, it seemed, in the vast stillness of rock and air, until suddenly Rudy realized that the men ahead had stopped. Saxo was pointing, and there above them, outlined on a crag, was a dark, brooding shape. It was a lammergeier, the great alpine bird of prey. And it was staring at them, wings poised, as if in the next moment it would plunge down in a savage attack. But its instinct apparently warned it that they were too big and too many, for when abruptly it took off, it was not down, but up. Its wings spread huge against the sky as it arched out from the mountainside. It whirled and swooped and glided, no longer a hideous vulture with tearing beak and talons, but a thing of soaring beauty, wild and free. And as Rudy watched, his heart soared too, up and up with the great bird, along the crest of the ridge, above the walls and precipices, higher and higher, until it swooped over the mountain's shoulder into the blue beyond. For that was where they too were going, not so swiftly as the lammergeier, no, not on wings, but still where they were going, where no man had ever been before. A surge of joy rose within him, filled his body, and burst without his willing it from his lips. Yuli-oo-lee-oo, Yuli-oo-lee-oo. I didn't do that very well, but that's what it kind of says there. It actually says that. Yuli-oo-lee. That's how it says it. Wild and free as the bird, his yodel rose into the mountain stillness, and the three men above him looked down at him, and Winter waved a hand, and then they climbed on. Through the long afternoon they climbed, up, along the spine of the ridge, out on the bordering faces when the spine grew too jagged, over crags and slabs, through clefts and chimneys, balancing with their axes, belaying with the rope, inching on and on up a wilderness of rock, reaching always for the next hold, the next stance, that they would bring them still higher. On the more difficult pitches they moved only one at a time. Sometimes there were long waits while they searched out on a route, and sometimes they chose a wrong one and had to back down and try again. But each time they at last found a way and went on to the next pitch and the next problem. They were very high now. Many of the lesser summits of the range were already below them, and the jutting outline of the fortresses far down the ridge appeared as remote as the glaciers and valleys. The air was thinning. Rudy's breathing was more rapid, but it caused him no particular difficulty, and though they had been climbing for almost 12 hours, he was still not tired. Up ahead, the others seemed to be all right too, moving slowly but steadily onward. Now and then Winter had a brief spell of coughing, but his pace remained the same as ever. The only other sound was the clinking of their axes and boot nails against the rock. Hand up, foot up, hand up, foot up. Then the climbing stopped. The rope connecting Rudy to Franz hung motionless, and there was another weight, longer than any before. After several minutes, he climbed up and found the three men standing together with his uncle and Saxo in the midst of an argument. Directly ahead, the crest of the ridge flared up in a smooth, holdless pitch, and it was obviously necessary to work around it, either to one side or the other. Franz was for going to the right, and Saxo to the left. The rock is sounder over here, said one, but too steep. The holds are good. On the far side they are better. The two guides faced each other, unyielding, and then they looked at Winter. The Englishman peered up on one side and then the other and rubbed the stubble along his jaw. Suppose we try the left, he said. Franz's lips tightened. But it is obvious, my captain, that either side looks passable, Winter replied. Down at the fortress we took our way. Here we try Saxo's. Franz hesitated. He seemed about to continue the argument. Then abruptly he turned away. With Saxo leading, they edged to the left above the south face, and within 10 minutes had bypassed the obstacle and regained the ridge. So, you see, said the man from Broly. Franz said nothing, but Rudy noticed that for a while thereafter the rope joining him to his uncle jerked more often and more violently than it had before. Up, still up, always up. And at last they were nearing the shoulder of the mountain. As it came closer, it grew larger, a vast snow-topped battlement looming above them that had blocked out half the sky. Thus far on the ascent, they had tried not to think or look too far ahead, concentrating on each problem as they encountered it. But now they could no longer keep their eyes from rising to that grim, forbidding mass. For if the fortress had been the first key to the mountain, the shoulder, they knew, would be the second, and they would either have to find a way up and over it or turn back in bitter defeat. That it was immense and formidable was plain at a glance, but if it was climbable, if it would go, they should not know until they reached it. From below, the perspective was too distorted for them to make out the details of its structure. Also, the light was fading. The sun had long since slanted off beside the mass of the mountain, and the ridge lay in deepening shadow. Obviously, they would not be able to reach even the base of the shoulder before dark. They had done enough for the first day. On that, even Franz and Saxo were agreed. Leaving the crest of the ridge, they found, after some search, a place level and sheltered enough for a campsite, and here they dropped their packs and pitched their two small tents. They rested. Then they ate their supper of dried meat, cheese, and bread, and brewed tea on a small spirit stove that Winter had brought up from Broly. The warmth of the tea was welcome, for it was growing colder. The shades of evening closed, gray and solemn, about them, and when they had finished eating, it was night. Still they sat for a while on the flat stones in front of the tents. The men smoked their pipes and talked desultorily. Desultorily. I've never seen that word. Desultorily. Desultorily. I don't know what that means. I'm going to have to look that one up. And Rudy beside them stared out across the gulf of darkness. In a vast arc around them, the snow peaks gleamed faintly, as if with an inner light of their own. Farther down were brooding rock walls and ghostly glaciers, and still farther the dim outlines of forests and valleys. The valley of Kurtal was not visible, and would not be until they came up over the shoulder. But yellow pricks of light winked up from even more distant villages, incredibly tiny and remote beyond the miles and the night. As he watched, it seemed to Rudy that he was no longer on the earth at all, but rather looking down upon it from an island in the sky. They were on their island, the first of all men. He looked around him and then slowly upward, his eyes fixed on the great shoulder rising back against the stars. And tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow. That is the end of chapter 14 from Banner in the Sky.